Everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Mid-Atlantic Arts Performing Arts Global Exchange Cultural Safety webinar. This is the first of two. We will be doing another one in November. My name is Bouchard. I'll be doing a more formal introduction here in a little bit. I want to briefly acknowledge that I am currently based on the now occupied lands of the Puyallup tribe. Although my home office is also on the lands of the Squaxin Island and Nisqually tribes. And we will be doing sort of a slow introduction here.
Did you want me to introduce myself? Sorry, I'm still waiting.
Yes.
Okay.
No worries.
No worries. Thank you so much. My name is Alethea Beetson. I am actually not where the slides will tell us that we are. I'm actually on Yugambeh country in the Gold Coast in Queensland of so-called Australia. And I am Kabi Wiradjuri, which are mobs kind of near here and one a little bit further down. So it is a very different time for me, for some of you folks. It's 5 a.m. in the morning. So it's really nice to hear. Thanks so much for having me. We're going to kick things off with a high context introduction. This is to kind of demonstrate the part of conversations that we'll have around welcoming Indigenous artists, and as someone who is of Kabi and Wiradjuri lineage, which is specific to the lands of so-called Australia and specific to those traditions, I can kind of really speak to those, but there's some commonalities across a number of the Indigenous artists that are participating in this project. And one of the content that from Arnie Lutson, who speaks about this predominantly on these lands, is a high context introduction when first meet Indigenous folks, when engaging Indigenous artists, usually connected to the relationality to the land and to each other. So who you are and where you are from, and often in mainstream or Western constructs, low context introductions, particularly in
We seem to be having a little bit of a bandwidth issue. I'm going to...
Okay. Do you want to just jump in and introduce yourself first then?
Yeah, just one moment. So I'm about to put in the chat. We're going to be doing introductions in the chat here, but so the high context introduction, gives context, sets the stage, and that sort of thing for the future interactions. It makes people feel welcome, and is inclusionary of people with disabilities, in sort of the Indigenous sort of context as well. For today, I also want to do, because I'm a speaker on this, a visual description. My name is Bouchard. I myself am of Kootenai, Ojibwe, Flathead Salish, and Pend d'Oreille descent. I am a man in my mid-40s. I'm wearing a shirt that looks blue, light blue, and is colored, but actually has purple in it. I'm in a room with a map behind me and a bookcase, but otherwise a white background. My pronouns are he, him. And again, I am on the lands of the Squaxin Island, Nisqually, and Puyallup tribes, by and large. My role here is I am a tour producer for several of the Performing Arts Global Exchange artists as they go on tour through Turtle Island, also known as North America. And I am the founder and executive creative producer of a nonprofit called Indigenous Performance Productions. So I'm going to put into the chat just now these things, so you can also introduce yourself.
Is my internet working again?
I believe so. It sounds like it.
Okay, I will introduce myself. I'll do that while also sharing the next slide, because the next slide goes through 2 examples of how you can introduce yourself into the chat box, and you can use that to introduce yourself as I'm speaking. So as mentioned before, my name is Alethea Beetson. I am a fair-skinned Indigenous woman with short blonde hair. I have pink woven earrings on and I suppose we call these flannel, like a brown flannel. I don't know if that translates, but a flannel get on as well. As I mentioned, I am on Yugambeh country, which is the so-called Gold Coast, but I usually reside on Turrbal, Yagara and Jagera country, which is in Brisbane in so-called Australia. I have family connections to Baramba, which is an Aboriginal settlement that is 2 hours where I guess I am from, is inland, the best way to describe that. And I also have family connections, obviously, down Wiradjuri country, which is a large chunk of New South Wales. I have a multitude of roles. I think for the context of this, I'm the artistic director of Digi Youth Arts and another company called Black Social. I also do a bunch of work in the music industry that involves some global context around respecting sovereignty in music streaming spaces. And I will let you all introduce yourself in the chat box and do that myself as well.
Find the unmute button. So we've begun. I see that Andrew has, go ahead. Thank you. I see people are doing it now. This is lovely. So I just sort of wanted to talk about sort of at the top, how to be sort of the cultural context of session overview and then culture. I think my notes are slightly out of order, so forgive me. So the cultural context and values of introductions. The introductions are very important within many social and cultural contexts. It's creating a space for people to get to know each other, connect, find connections, and these are the things that become, generally create the pathway for deeper interactions. It's important, not just in Indigenous contexts, but in sort of an intercultural context, to create an inclusive space. And the things that you ask for in introductions also set forward your value. You will find that in many sort of culturally Indigenous rooms, that a lot more time is spent on check-ins and sort of talking about where individuals are with regards to their families, not just their cultural context, with regards to the community, with regards to where they're at in terms of their ceremonial practice within their cultural practice, and the meaning that these things entail. And so, yeah, there are natural cycles with regards to culture on a yearly basis and that sort of thing. And by inviting this information, of course, you create an inclusive environment and sort of the framework for decolonizing your interactions, instead of sort of getting down to business. There is an opportunity at the introduction end of things to start things off, slow down time, and that sort of thing. You'll find that Indigenous time values are a little bit different sometimes. not universally necessarily, but sometimes, than Western ones. So I also have notes here that I'm supposed to talk a little bit about optical versus non-optical allyship. Or is that, yeah, am I out of context here? I think.
Quickly, no, just do a quick session overview. And
yeah,
I'll
session
talk,
overview.
And then I'll talk about the questions, yes.
So session overview. So the goals of the session, this is a pretty high level session. It's more of a sort of a 101. And recognizing that people are on a vast continuum of paths with regards to their equity journey. Some people are just beginning their equity journey, perhaps in this virtual room. Some people have been working on this as intensively as your moderators here might have been. And so I want to recognize that there is a vast amount of cultural knowledge in this virtual room, that there are people who are much further, and sort of the overview and context of this is to lay the foundation to get people started on their path and perhaps deepen the level for people who are a little bit further on their equity journey. Also to give them, connections and that sort of thing for people in their community who might need further information to progress on their equity journey. We're here to offer guidance about strategies and for a path to learn to grow and an opportunity to dialogue. I personally can't claim to be an absolute expert on the 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States. It's a vast subject, not to mention the other Indigenous people that were colonized by the United States. And so in my own personal humility, that my context is that I am a learner on these as well, these subjects as well, cultural context. Thank you, everyone. I see so many great people. Wow, and some highly developed. Oh, hi, Norman. I was like, this is a highly developed introduction. Oh, it's from Norman. Who? So excellent.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Jay. I'll just do a little quick overview of how questions fall out through the session. I also want to reiterate or extend on what Andre has said. Obviously, I am a Kabi and Wiradjuri person on the lands of so-called Australia, and that is the context in which I can speak to. I do work in an Indigenous context globally and nationally and locally. So that knowledge, which I will hopefully share and be of use for you today, is more about finding your approach to being able to engage with each individual artist or present artists that are to your institution or your venue, so that you can get the specificity that is for those individuals. And I think one of the things to acknowledge, and we'll acknowledge this further when we talk a little bit about the Style Guide, in our future seminar, the second seminar that we'll be doing later on in the year, we will be bringing different expertise into that space based on the lands in which those folks are from. So I know in a so-called Australian context, there's Indigenous artists who are not Indigenous to so-called Australia. So we'll be considering that context, as well as my brothers and sisters across the oceans in our world. In terms of questions, there is along the box where you've got mute, stop video, all of that, you'll have, and then you've just located the chat box and you're putting all your wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. There's also a Q&A button. So you can put your questions in the Q&A box. any time throughout the presentation. I know sometimes a question pops up, and if you don't ask it, you will forget it. I know I certainly do that. So you're welcome to write your question into that Q&A box throughout the presentation. We will answer the questions either live, like we're speaking to you, or via text through the presentation. And questions that we don't get to during the presentation, we will answer afterwards. And I also want to note, for those of you who want to save your questions to the end, if that's your preference, that there's a Q&A section at the conclusion of the presentation.
So I wanted to put in a note sort of briefly about how to be an ally. Is this a good place for that, Alethea? Yes, I think so. Yeah, okay, there we are. The slides that I printed out are out of order. I don't know how that happened, but it's a little bit nerve-wracking. So there's sort of a phenomena in many fields and that sort of thing. I think more so after sort of the advent of the land acknowledgement becoming sort of commonplace, where people end up becoming an ally on the surface only. And an equity sort of term for this is an optical ally. And so the encouragement here is to become a non-optical ally. And that is becoming a non-optical ally, and also recognizing that some of the people on this webinar are actually in this movement as well, such as Christopher Morgan, who I just saw in the chat, is recognizing that we start from different places due to historic trauma resulting from past and present issues. A non-optical ally, in sort of broad terms, would seek to confront injustice as they see it. Does more than say the words, but acts on them as well, apportioning resources, money, time, and that sort of thing, and who seeks to, substantively, sway the hearts of people who are still perhaps further behind on their equity journey. And this can manifest in a lot of different ways. I tell people that a land acknowledgement is a first step and should be viewed as such, and that there's substantive things that they can do which perhaps don't even cost money. Entering into dialogue with Indigenous people, asking them what they perhaps want is a good first step, and viewing these relationships as investments. You'll hear this from me a lot, actually. So moving on.
Thank you. I wanted to add to that, and this is just sorry, my mute button, sharing my screen, figuring all this out. Sorry, I feel like I'm driving a really old spaceship at the moment with how this is navigating, so please bear with me. I wanted to add that around, and it's just language that I want to also just acknowledge the limitations of the English language often speaking about Indigenous context, including change context and decolonizing and resurgence and indigenizing contexts. But the shift from allyship to accomplices and going through a journey, which not as a cross community that is on this channel, I'm very grateful to be in all of your presence and heard of all the wonderful journeys that you're all on and the stages that you're on. But moving that shift from allyship to accomplices, or becoming that, non-optical ally, is often that first step into allyship is considered one of the first steps into race and social justice work, or other contexts as well. Whereas moving into the accomplice kind of realm goes beyond to advocacy, and it's actually using the privileges that many folks might have, and I am someone who has privilege in my country and have to use that privilege for the greater of my community, to challenge existing conditions at the risk of their own comfort and well-being, whereas an ally might work to change on an individual level, and accomplice aims to tackle racial injustice and a variety of other issues in the equity realm, institutional level. And I think because so many folks are here on this journey at an institutional level, there's definitely this lifelong commitment and journey into being into that accomplices, which can fit into that anti-racism work that we kind of also did in this space, in acknowledging the issues that exist because of colonisation, wherever that might have rolled out, and in the text that has rolled out, and then addressing those issues within that wider structural institutional lens to create greater change. So I think I just want to acknowledge the journey that Evra is on, and also the deep commitment that folks are making to create this wider change. And I'm going to just drive back to a slide that we missed earlier, which is totally fine, but I wanted to also speak to this idea of language temporality. And I suppose, and again, I can only speak from the context of my country, but I know that the term ally and allyship is one of those words that in this particular context where I am is at risk of being appropriated in the way that the term conciliation was once appropriated, and being self-appointing that folks are allies. It is actually just a lifelong journey of accountability and process. And with that, I think it's important to acknowledge that the journey that myself is on, and perhaps yourselves, it is a lifelong journey connected to community, and the language that might be used throughout this session is indicative of the most accepted phrases used, and not everyone will necessarily have the same relationship to some of this terminology. So much of the terminology that is used when discussing Indigenous art has also been adopted by the state to disrupt dominant cultural practice. And one example from this, particularly in the so-called Australian context, and I know it exists elsewhere, based on my studies, that the terms traditional and contemporary are sometimes used by the state or the government colony to question the authenticity of Indigenous works, but this labelling practice does not always reflect the roles in which the community may view those terms. So there is a conversation that is happening in my communities here. We often, in land acknowledgements, we call them acknowledgement to country in a so-called Australian context. They're essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same thing. We just refer to country as our land, and there's a conversation when we do those particular acknowledgements. We acknowledge the traditional custodians, and there's a conversation that's even happening in community to drop the word traditional because it suggests something else, and it should suggest living in the past, and that we are actually living and we're still here as those custodians. So this conversation's happening now, and where this conversation is about change, decolonizing and re-indigenizing. And so I think it's really important to note that perhaps the style guide, it is a living and breathing document, and we'll speak to that, but everything will evolve and change, particularly in your journey and in your time. This almost was a good way if I was looking at my slides. So that leads me to just providing a brief overview of the style guide that we have provided. And then Andre will speak to that in more detail. So we've provided a style guide, and I really want to acknowledge that it is a living and breathing document, and there is expertise from Indigenous folks from those backgrounds who will be adding to that, and resources that will be put into that have been checked by folks from those spaces. It really is, as Andre mentioned at the top of the session, to this particular seminar is that it's very one, and it is an approach and some guidance for you to know how to communicate about the Indigenous works and programs that you are participating in, having in your programs, and also it helps you provide an approach that will lead to you on Indigenous people wherever they may come from in a way specific to their ancestral lineage and protocols and practices. There's information what is colonial language, and hopefully that can assist in how to communicate and perhaps change some of the communications. And there's two perspectives at the moment, and we'll be adding more identity and naming because we are looking at a global context here, and it is different. It's different within our country and our continent. So when you add that global lens, it becomes even more vast again. But that vast provides so much richness, so much exciting opportunities within the arts space over there.
So, I think that I had a note about colonial language next. And so I was just going to start talking about one of the largest opportunities when engaging with an Indigenous artist is by looking at the language that you use and replacing colonial language with language that's more reflective of the values that would make someone of Indigenous culture feel at home. Language is one of the sort of the vestiges of colonialism that can be destructive actively and can cause harm to Indigenous people. Uses of phrases or words that derive from conquest of land, violence, and both towards First Peoples, Indigenous peoples, but also violence in general. And in the document, we have sort of a very high-level list of ideas. For instance, referring to Indigenous or First Peoples as ancient, a people of the past, perhaps extinct, that sort of thing. But there's other common terms, particularly in the United States, that I can list off the top of my head that are referential to a very dark ideas. Circle the wagons, for instance. If you've ever heard the term circle with the wagons, that's a colonial term where settlers would come onto land and upon seeing, Indigenous people, they would circle their wagons and point their guns to the outside. And, it's a reference to a violent attitude towards Indigenous people, but also moving through seemingly similar, innocent ideas. The term bullet points in documents. If you're looking at removing violent references from your language, you could replace the idea of bullet points with dot points. Pull the trigger, also a reference to sort of violence and that sort of thing. So I light the fire, as it were, and that sort of thing. So the idea that colonial language, that language is reference, that we have unconsciously many references towards violence, oppression, reference to terms that are misused, reference, for instance, when people mention totem poles, or most everyone doesn't understand actually what a totem pole is, and usually the most important image on the totem pole is on the bottom, not the top. It's not a ranking. It's if you don't understand the cultural context behind a word, perhaps it's time to replace it. And so that's sort of my, my personal practice on the language I use. I'm always looking at the language I use, and I don't always get it right. And so it's a process again, of being more precise in how I speak, being more respectful in how I speak, having humility to reflect on how I say things, and that sort of thing. And so this is part of your journey. And so we have just a few paragraphs with terms and that sort of thing. But it speaks to a deeper process for certain. Are we on, do I roll into identity and naming now? I think
yes, that's my button. Yeah.
So you've perhaps heard me say a number of different terms: Indigenous, First Nations. The US government uses Native American, American Indian. These all are being used by Indigenous people. And when it comes down to it, names are important. When in doubt, I guide people to dialogue with whomever you are describing and ask how they would like to be described. When in doubt, be as specific as possible. Name the Indigenous group that they identify themselves as, or that identifies them as part of their number. But, if there are no resources or that sort of thing to dialogue, look for how they talk about themselves. If you're, I used to be a marketing director, and so if you're on a marketing deadline and the question of how they identify themselves can't be dialogued with, the best you can do is look at how they identify, like how they write about themselves, and use that language. But yeah, so language is important. I put a note about pronunciation about tribes. If I end up with an Indigenous group that I don't know how to pronounce, I'll try to find them on their website. One of my personal tricks to hear pronunciation, if they don't have one adequately on their, that helps me enough on their website, is I call their office after hours and hear how they introduce themselves. And so that's one of my secret tricks that I use as a pronunciation guide. So yeah, names are important. Be careful about names.
Thank you,
yes.
Thank you. I want to really just highlight, I think, because one of the reasons why we're yarning today is because of this cultural exchange, and because of the divide that exists probably more in a colonial context between the various nations that will be coming together as part of this program. I learned so much from exchange with other Indigenous folks from different lands, and I just really want to thank Andre and the various different folks who are from other places that have taught me, because then it's enabled me to come back to so-called Australia and create different processes that we might not be using the best language in reference to other Indigenous cultures. So it's this ongoing learning process, and that dialogue is incredibly important. And I think the biggest perler of advice you just gave that I would love to just highlight again is, if you don't understand the cultural context of a word, perhaps think about using a different one or finding out what it is, which I think is incredibly important. To highlight the importance of ID and naming, and this is more a study than necessarily giving you information, is speaking about the variety of different terms that might be acceptable in a so-called Australian context. So the main terms that are used interchangeably here are First Nations, Indigenous with a capital I, always a capital I, and always capital for everything over here, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander and Black and Zenadeh Keth. They're the common terms. Anything in and around outside that usually is not used. Different Indigenous folks will have, I guess, different opinions about that. But I'll just go through and explain what each one means and then kind of talk about some of those different opinions. So the term Aboriginal, and please I'm using the term Aboriginal person, is that's using Aboriginal on its own is very othering and not appropriate. And the term Aborigine, which was used quite a few years ago, is very retired and not a term that we use and can, cause offence if that term is used about Indigenous folks who are Aboriginal. So that's the mainland of Australia, who are on that particular region. And it is a broad term again, because we have over 400, 500 country groups as well, that are basically the custodians of mainland Australia and most of the islands, including Tasmania, Fraser Island, Palm Island, Kootenai Island, and some of the island names are obviously the colonial reference. The term Torres Strait Islander, which I'm not a Torres Strait Islander person, but I can speak to what that means, is a broad term grouping peoples, I think around over 270 small islands between Cape York, which is the tip of Queensland or Australia, and Papua New Guinea. And a lot of Strait Islander folks live Australian mainland, and there's a couple of Torres Strait Island, territories in the peninsula of Queensland. Because the Torres Strait Island name again comes from colonial background, where often Torres Strait Islanders are referring to themselves as Zenadeh Keth, and there's some information there where you can go look that up. Not all, for example, Aboriginal folks like even being referred to as Aboriginal. There are some folks who take problem with that because the shortened version of that has been used and is we use a really derogatory term. And so some people prefer to be, if they're being grouped, this is a grouping, that they prefer called perhaps something different. A lot of folks prefer to be referenced by their actual tribals or their country groups. So that's Kabi, and Oreille. However, due to the continued ongoing removal of children, Indigenous children, from community, there's still a lot of trauma and disconnect associated with that to be able to have some kind of blanket rule. And I think on that, there is no blanket rule. There's also a need for dialogue and an approach to create what specific individual needs. And then the last thing to reference, because this comes up a lot in a global context, you may see the term Black without the C used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander folks, and that is a way to express our collective identity through Blackness, and actually came from a Torres Strait Islander and Aboriginal artist Jenny Deacon to reclaim colonizing language. So it was the way the colonization rolled out in this context. I think Blackness was the way in which we were othered and created the space for the way in which colonization rolled out in a sort of Australian context. And so that is the experience we have. That doesn't also fit necessarily within a global construct. And so some folks, not all, because America's race politics does not determine ours, but some folks also remove the C because it helps differentiate us from that global context as well. So we've provided a bunch of resources, and we'll keep adding to these resources as this journey goes on. So we have the style guide, which again is a living document and will be added to. I've also put in products for using First Nations to intellectual property in the arts, in the Australia Council of the Arts. That's a document that, like all documents, is really used just to provide an approach to how to determine the various language and stuff that you need. And we'll talk a little bit more about that from a protocol perspective. And I'll let Andre speak to the resources that he's added into the list.
Yes, certainly. So the little 5-page style guide is sort of an idea of getting you going and sort of getting you started on some of these topics. There's entire books written about so many of these topics. You know, for instance, blood quantum for you know, Native American folk, invisibility. Ideas such as that, and you can really do a deep dive on these sort of topics if you do so choose. So the Native Land organization, Indigenous Land Guide for Turtle Island, they have an app that many people are aware of. You can put in your location, and it can give you a pretty accurate depiction of the ancestral lands upon which you are if you are in Turtle Island. My understanding is there are resources in lots of other places that are being developed for these purposes as well. This is a movement that is gaining strength as it goes. More people are getting into it. Land Acknowledgement Guide. This is one that I'm fond of. It's an article. The Land Acknowledgement Guide for Turtle Island is the native land.gov or what is it? Native government. It's right here. It's beyond. Yeah, Native Gov. It's an organization that has a number of lovely publications about sort of what the role of land acknowledgement is and the next steps you might be able to take. Other sort of resources that you can use, and I put this in here, is many people in college or university settings have formal liaisons that have been working to build relationships over years with local tribal or indigenous entities. And those can be resources for you as well. You don't have to reinvent things necessarily. There are some ways that you can get a little bit of a fast track with regards to these relationships. And there are people who have done the investment over the long period of time and have plans in place for how to decolonize your institution and look at the systemic racism, perhaps that's been. Resources also include yield elements of Indigenous style, published out of Canada. I'm not sure which the publisher is, but the author is Gregory Youngling. And this has, for folk on Turtle Island, a pretty thorough listing of terms, their history, and ways to replace them. And I actually use this as a reference book myself because there's a lot of thought that's gone into this by a lot of smart people. But also I would like to invite you to do sort of research, if you haven't already, about Indigenous groups in your region, in your city, in the area that you're at, and sort of understand who they are, what they're about. And this can be individuals, governments, non-government organizations, educational organizations, community organizations. And they all have different sort of things that they offer their communities and different ways that you can sort of plug in as well, as it were, to those. So resources. Yes. So many of them are online, some of them are published, but we're out of Presentation mode. Okay. Oh, that was just interesting. Okay. Oh, we lost Alethea.
I'm sure she'll be right back with us. We can
Yeah, we'll give it a moment for her to get back. In the meantime, if anyone has questions that they would like to put forward for us to address at the end of the session, I would, oh, she's back. I'd like to invite you to put in the questions. I see that we have one question. Welcome back, Alethea. And someone is deciding to pound on my ceiling right now. All right. So I believe we were at the slide welcoming Indigenous artists. Yes. Next.
Just moving there now. There you go.
Presentation for our times. So as everyone here is a presenter, or most everyone here is a presenter. So my guidance to folks that I work with, and I'm running 13 tours, God help me, next year, is to approach relationships with humility. Assume that you aren't the expert, assume that you don't know things. I end up in situations all the time where I'm in a new, within a culture that is not my own. And I might say to myself for a moment, oh, I've got this, but that doesn't serve me well. What serves me well is to put myself in a humble mindset and to assume that I don't have this, to assume that I need to, that I'm a learner. And that there are elders present, there are culture bearers present, there are people who can be instructive to me, and that by observing and noting things, I like to use a tool that I learned in my anthropology training. Anthropology is a problematic field, don't get me wrong, but some of the methodology that's used, I was taught in my field study to watch for repetition of words and values, and to sort of note those mentally. And those can be informative. Those can be a guide to how you sort of structure your understanding about a culture that is not your own. So I also tell people to structure your time so that there's a long tail going into things and out of things. So if you have an event that you're working on, make time to dialogue with the artist, make time to dialogue with your community. I also encourage people to evaluate their environment. Do you have perhaps a portrait of Andrew Jackson somewhere in your building that has not been burned? Andrew Jackson's, of course, being a U.S. president who has a problematic history. And while I'm not, advocating that you pile the $20 bills in your wallet and burn them in your lobby, I'm not discouraging you from doing that. Sorry, just humor. So many presenters I talk with and I have relationships want to use an Indigenous artist as an opportunity to connect with an Indigenous community or a group or that sort of thing in their local area. I would put forward and encourage people to view any engagement as not beginning or ending. It's an ongoing investment. And if you're going to ask them to engage with you, if you're going to ask them to trust you, because the context with many Indigenous people is that trust has been given and betrayed many, 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 many times over, up into the present day. I am frequently asked to donate my time and resources and knowledge and connections. And it is rarer than I would like for people to offer to invest in me or my organization in return. And I have a lot of patience with that, but it does become tiresome being asked to donate over and over my time and my knowledge and my connections. And so that's a context that a lot of people of color, not just Indigenous people, have, that people come to them asking for things, but without necessarily the intention of investing time, energy, resources, and that sort of thing. So again, keyword investment.
I might just throw to you for this question because it's off the back of what you've said. So Sarah has a question around struggling with the balance between asking artists how they prefer to be addressed or to be introduced and asking them to do emotional labor on my behalf. So did you want to speak to that? Because it came what you just said.
Well, my job is to be patient, and sort of the role that I've taken upon myself is I try my best to become people's gentle first step on their road, on their pathway, in their equity journey. And so speaking to the chat, aspects, was this the question from Sarah or the question from
Sarah, the bottom question? Yeah.
So it's important that we don't speak for someone, that we let them speak for themselves, right? That the context that they have, that they carry, is their context. And that even as an Indigenous person who works with Indigenous people, I find myself getting a little bit ahead of myself and writing something about a client of mine who is going to be on tour and not representing them as they would like to represent themselves. And so this is a continuous lesson of humility. So there are words that they have context for, that, and this is a little bit vague, but giving the time and space for an Indigenous artist to give you guidance about how to form the language, how to form the imagery that you use, and making this a dialogue about how this language, this context that the artist brings in, will then interact with the cultural community in which you reside in. And everyone resides in an area where there's multiple cultures, and culture is everywhere. It governs what we eat, who we marry, how we raise our children, how we treat our elders, the language we use, like how fast we work, how we treat time. It's a lens that's pervasive and invisible, and you just can't assume anything about the culture of anyone, because it can shift. And so this is a moving target, and there's no easy way around it than to just put your head down and do the work. And that's a place of patience, that's a place of listening, that's a place of humility, that's a place of non-expertise. It feels a little bit uncomfortable for myself, working in the performing arts field for 24 years now, and not feel like an expert. But that's something that you have to come to terms with. Alethea, you something to add?
Yeah, no, and I suppose it's it is a form of protocol over here to ask people who they are and where they're from. So to kind of address that balance, it's a respectful process if the information's not provided, because I have an artist pack that I send that even has a voice memo of how to say my name and how to say my tribal groups as an example, because I just know that the beauty of being a producer and an artist, I know how to make producers' lives easier, because I know what makes my life easier. But it is like a form of protocol to be asked. So I think it's, yeah, when it comes to asking how individual Indigenous artists and artist collectives want to be spoken about, I think it's really respectful to do that. And I think the tips that have been given around checking how folks speak about themselves in their bio, how they speak about themselves on an online context is really helpful. And to jump back into this notion of welcoming Indigenous artists before I move on to community outreach as protocol, as someone who, you know, I'm a visitor right now in Yugambeh country, lines come back to where I am from. I'm also a visitor on Wiradjuri and Yagara country, and so Brisbane, even the lines will connect through there. Being welcomed as a visiting Indigenous person, which, you know, becomes told when I travel across oceans to my cousins across the world, being welcomed by Indigenous folks is a real important aspect of, I suppose, practice and my protocol for me, as we defer to the land that we are on in terms of protocol and making sure we respect that protocol first. So if, for example, I was in a yarning circle in another space, I probably wouldn't speak until the folks that have spoken from that or have given me permission to. So I think it's just important for those artists who are coming across oceans to visit you, checking on what their individual processes are around being welcomed. Quite often, I know that, you know, we prefer to be welcomed by Indigenous folk because it's part of our protocol here. And if that's not possible, that's okay. But just wanting to kind of flag that, because I know folks have relationships with the local communities in which they are from. And so I know there's been some questions from folks around this, like the community outreach activities. And I think, you know, from my perspective as someone who has visited your lands and done engagement and work, like engaging with Indigenous communities through these activities often forms part of an obligation that First Nations, and particularly visiting First Nations artists, have when performing in other territories, because it is their land and there is a respect that we have for that. So often those activities provide a deep meaning for us to be able to connect with those communities. And, you know, as my old people have said, if I connect with the Indigenous communities on whose land I am, my artwork will be better anyway, because that's just how our spirituality and our philosophy around performance and protocol go. So I just kind of want to flag, depending on the artist and the community, because again, different people are at their journey, even as Indigenous people, there might be certain processes that they'd like to follow in organising these activities. And it's a case-by-case determination, and it's a conversation that you can have. And it's, you know, in the same way that you would organise the logistics, not that it's the same as the logistics, in the same way that you might organise the logistics around, say, community outreach programs, you can also have a conversation about, you know, what your protocols and processes might need to be for that. And, you know, only speak to me, but if I'm visiting a place, I like to be the Indigenous person that is involved, just as, and to provide a pathway for Indigenous folks who might be connecting to speak to each other is so important. Because there's, you know, I think when I was working on Big Sound, which is a music market here in so-called Australia, we have Indigenous exchange that we did. Our organisations would speak, and we would speak at an organisational level, and then we would have our own yarning catch up as Indigenous people to kind of understand the context in which we're coming from. And there's nuances and there's things that we can discuss as Indigenous people that are really important. So I think, you know, when it comes to those community outreach activities, they can be a really, really important part of that protocol. And for me, like we won't, you know, folks in the context of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, for example, if there's a local festival, and I work on Brisbane Festival, so it might be speaking this way, So I won't engage with that festival to Jack unless I know that the traditional custodians or the custodians of the landowners are engaged, and that there's also local artists being performed. So there's sometimes protocol around the places that we, choose to kind of go to, because it's really important that Indigenous folks are honoured as part of our artistic protocol moving forward.
I would like to say
anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I wanted to sort of address a comment that was left in the chat about sort of the sort of difficulties in apprehending language leading to basically paralysis and basically silencing people. And yeah, I mean, that our goal is not to create a situation where people feel silenced and people feel paralyzed. I do see this sometimes in people who I end up seeing, time and time again, and meeting with at conferences, and people that I develop, good speaking relationships with, basically confiding with me that they just don't know where to start. It just seems like no matter what they do, they'll end up misstepping. And the context that I share with them is that my experience with Indigenous cultures is that they are loving and welcoming, and that an earnest, truthful attempt to do the right thing is almost always recognized. And that while we have all these cautions about, be reflective of your language, your environment, all these other things, how you talk with your community about indigeneity, there's a continuum, and everyone recognizes that. And yeah, you'll make mistakes, and that's fine, right? Like, that you will be welcomed and loved, most likely, for giving it a good shot, and doing the work and actually starting to make an investment, right? And it's better to be, giving it a shot. It's like getting up on stage for the first time when you're like 9 years old and that sort of thing. Like, it's terrifying, but it's, the rewards are so great. I find tremendous joy in my own native culture, but also in the native cultures, the Indigenous cultures that I work with on, a daily basis. And the connection and, the love that I feel from that. It's just, it's hard to explain. But the value is that recognizing that the people are in different places, if you're trying, that will be recognized. So I hopefully that helps.
Thank you. We've reached the kind of conclusion, and I want to make sure there's chat questions, and I know there's a question in the chat we need to get to. I'll just quickly speak. We've spoken to this as a resource that can help with protocols for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander artists that are visiting. Basically, it's just one of the resources that's in the list, and there's sort of folks there. Andre, did you want to speak to this, or do you want to move on to questions? I know you've addressed some of this.
Yeah, I've addressed.
Should we just move into questions?
I mean, these are just general questions to sort of move you on your equity journey. If you haven't asked these questions already, just have them at the back of your mind. You don't have to tackle everything at once. So what is the history of my organization, my building, the city, place where I reside? Just finding out these stories, if they're told from an Indigenous standpoint, and trying to understand that and having that context when you go into things. Are you a part of systems that have been in place to promote colonialist values? The one of the systems that I rail against is actually in the performing arts booking circuit. The notion that there are buyers and sellers, and I say this everywhere all the time, is that I am a part of my culture. I don't own my culture. I can share it. I can't sell it. So it's really an anathema to me, or just it's my pet peeve, my most recent pet peeve, that there is a notion that you are buying something from us, that we are selling something. So yeah, asking these questions of just even the title that you might have in your organization, and how that might be changed from a systemic standpoint. And the last one is how have you created space for Indigenous people to tell their stories? And that can be in any way. And again, first steps are first steps, and first steps are great. I'd like to see a first step from so many different people. If everyone in the country did one first step, then there would be a massive shift in, you know, the creative industry, in our culture, in you know, just the world, I think. Anyways, thank you, Christopher Morgan. Christopher Morgan had a great note about context about welcoming Indigenous people to place. I encourage you to share that. Christopher is just as qualified to teach this as I am, or more, I don't know. So.
Thank you. We've got some contact details there that you might find helpful. And this is now the time where we have a chance for questions. So feel free to put those questions in the Q&A section, or if you want to pop your hand up, Andrew, who's helping us out, will be able to help facilitate. But I'm just going to go to the chat. There's been a question that's, again, I think, Andre, that I'll read for you. I'm interested in any aspects that particularly come into play with market Indigenous artists and educating audiences without making the experience didactic, and any effective tools or suggestions. I think you're on mute.
Well, that's a good. I mean, one of the tactics that I've used with regards to sort of like getting community education sort of in play is to a number of the artists that I've worked with have created lobby exhibitions, or just components, but also in programs and that sort of thing. So people can come to this information at their own pace, on their own time, and sort of use it as a first step. Other things that I've seen done very well is invitation of Indigenous artists, local Indigenous groups that you know are you know to set up in lobbies or adjacent spaces to also offer an education component, using the platform that you have to amplify additional Indigenous voices. People, if allowed, if given the opportunity, you know, as a member of the community that your theater serves, to connect afterwards and to build on that, will end up educating themselves, in my opinion. So there's a, I mean, it involves the investment of time and thought and that sort of thing, but sort of like the educational component, without being patronizing, can be done in elegant and sort of subtle ways. The storytelling that I was brought up with didn't beat you over the head with the moral of the story. You were allowed to sit and think about, well, what did these characters do? How did they treat each other, and that sort of thing. And you sort of came to the meaning on your own. And so I would encourage sort of more of an environmental approach personally, that you create an environment that is decolonized, that has the voices of Native, Indigenous people in it that your community can then come to, right? And that's sort of that's been my approach, and I feel as though that's been relatively successful in the ways that I've set it forward, and my artists have done so in the past. I sort of hesitate to say that it's like marketing, and I still struggle personally with the idea or how to market Indigenous cultural work, because art is culture, if it is anything, to sort of like the public. And so, yeah, I'm on that journey myself, to understand exactly how you can, you know, have people, you know, buy tickets and yet decolonize the experience and encourage people by this experience that they have, which is also locked behind sort of this paywall frequently. And so there is sort of a duality to much of the work that I do and interact with, in that yeah, I mean, these experiences, these cultural experiences are locked behind a paywall, and ideally they're not. Ideally they are free and open, and this becomes just a community experience. But the economics of our field are what they are, and we are reliant upon earned income revenue, unfortunately. So this is something I've thought a lot about, and I'm not sure if I have the answers. Sarah. You can call me up, Sarah, if you want a dialogue about this. So. So Andrew just put in the chat, now might be a good time to mention the Maori component. So I've put forward an invitation to Jack Gray to, in the next webinar, discuss sort of Maori context for all this. We had a number of resource and time limitations, and so this is a little bit more focused on the cultures of the moderators and the context thereof. But we are actively seeking to include more cultural context specific to the Performing Art Global Exchange cohort, as it were. So yes, yes.
A reminder, if you want to ask a question, we can turn on your mic. So you just need to raise your hand. Or pop it in the Q&A or chat box. We can put it in the chat box.
So a note about silence. I love silence. I love when a meeting goes into silence, because I don't know, it's a cultural value of mine, that we can exist together without saying anything. But anyways, I used to feel awkward, but now I don't.
If there's no more questions, we can wrap this up. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you so much, Andre, for all of your guidance and wisdom and this that you hold given the land context of this program. The slides style guide will be out tomorrow, and you've got our contact details. If you want to flick us an email question, I'm happy to take that. I think Andre is happy to take that. I don't want to put that for you, but I'm pretty sure he's into dialogue. So thank you all so much for being here. We really appreciate it and look forward to the next session.
Likewise. Semblance. Go on.